In 1936, with Japan's withdrawal from the existing treaties and all the new construction, it was decided that new training ships were needed. Thus were started the 5,890-ton Katori class training cruisers. While yes, their armament and displacement did technically put them in the light cruiser category, calling them such is being pretty generous. Superfluously, for example, while other cruisers were named after rivers, they were named after shrines. To speed construction and keep costs down, they were built to merchant rather than more durable military standards. There was minimal subdivision. Clearly, being in a fight isn't what they were made for. Main armament was very light for a cruiser, on par with the Tenryus, which were totally outdated. Heavy anti-aircraft was a mere single twin mount, clearly meant more for training than for effectiveness. Torpedo armament was also so light that it was obviously meant more for training than fighting. Just to drive the point home, the torpedoes were 21-inch rather than the standard 24-inch Type 93 Long Lance. Aircraft capacity was one plane on one catapult. Again, just enough for training, but not enough to be useful in practice. One semi-notable aspect of their design was a relatively high width-to-length ratio. While this hurt hydrodynamic dynamic efficiency, it did make them stable ships. Probably a good thing since they were meant to carry green officers unused to the pitching and rolling of a ship at sea. Another thing was that they readopted the use of a forecastle deck that ran from the bow to the funnel to help keep them dry. Finally, propulsion was mixed. They used a combination of steam turbine and diesel engines. This offered excellent fuel economy and opportunities to cross-train, but their maximum speed was only 18 knots. Due to funding and industrial limitations, the first two were started nearly at the same time. The third, though, was started almost a year and a half later. The fourth, nearly a year and a half after that. With war fast approaching, or already started in the case of China, and the need to refit or complete more capable ships taking priority, the last ship was canceled after only minimal work had begun. Anyway, at the start of the war, they were essentially relegated as floating headquarters and transports, in addition to training duties. This was pretty reasonable, actually. They obviously weren't going to be running with the big boys, and it wasn't hard to convert classrooms and staff rooms into berthing. As the war ground on, they were modified to act as anti-submarine escorts and convoy flagships. Katori was started August 24, 1938, and completed April 20, 1940. Kashimi was started October 6, 1938, and completed May 31, 1940. Kashi was started May 30, 1940, and completed July 15, 1941. Kashima was started August 23, 1941, but canceled November 5, 1941. Main armament was four 140mm 50 caliber guns in two twin turrets, one forward and one aft. Secondary armament was two 5-inch 40 caliber anti-aircraft guns in one twin mount superfiring the rear main turret. Torpedo armament was two twin tubes for four 21-inch Type 6 torpedoes, one mount on either side of the funnel. Propulsion was three boilers venting to one funnel that delivered steam to two turbines that produced 4,400 horsepower. They also had two diesel engines, also venting to the funnel, that could produce 3,600 horsepower, also connected to the two propeller shafts. With a combined 8,000 horsepower, they had a top speed of only 18 knots. They had one rudder. Protection was minimal, 51 millimeters of deck armor over the vitals and 6 to 10 millimeters around the turrets, magazines, and conning towers. Modifications were very few on Katori before her loss, a few more light anti-aircraft guns. Between late March and late April 1944, Kashi was modified into an anti-submarine escort. Sonar was fitted along with Type 21 radar. 2 depth charge rails and 4 depth charge throwers were added. Up to 300 depth charges could now be carried. The 2 twin torpedo mounts were replaced with 2 twin 5-inch 40 caliber anti-aircraft mounts. In late June 1944, Type 22 radar was added. Between late December 1944 and mid-February 1945, Kashima was similarly converted. Sonar was installed, as were 2 depth charge rails and 4 depth charge launchers for 100 depth charges. Again, both torpedo mounts were exchanged for 2 twin 5-inch 40 caliber heavy anti-aircraft mounts. Types 22 and 13 radar were added. Katori was at Kwajalein in the Marshalls as flagship of the submarine squadron supporting the raid on Pearl Harbor on December 7th. Soon after, she sailed to Truk, where she hosted the planning for the invasion of Rubal in January of 1942. Soon afterward, she returned to Kwajalein and was there on February 1st when aircraft from the carrier Enterprise raided the island, and partly for training, partly for morale, and partly to try to deter the use of the Marshalls as a staging area for any potential invasion of Hawaii. Having been damaged in the raid, she returned to Japan for repairs that lasted until mid-March. In mid-April, she returned to Truk, then bounced back to Kwajalein in early May. There, she essentially stayed until early August, when she returned to Japan for a refit. With that completed, in late August, she sailed to Truk, where, with the exception of occasional return to Japan, she remained as flagship of the submarine force in the South Pacific until February of 1944. On February 17, 1944, the U.S. fleet raided Truk to put it out of action as an effective Japanese base. At about 5 a.m., Katori was escorting ships north of the island when the attack began. Hit by an aircraft torpedo, she turned south and slowly staggered back toward Truk for emergency repairs. At still 40 miles north of Truk at about 1 p.m., a group of American surface ships, including cruisers and the battleships Iowa and New Jersey, which had been sent north of the island to sink any ships trying to escape, caught her. Hit repeatedly, she finally rolled over to port and sank stern first. Kashima was at Truk when the war started. In January, she covered the invasion of Rabaul and the Northern Solomons. With the exception of occasional returns to Japan, she was essentially remaining in that Truk-Rubal area as a flag and training ship until mid-November of 1943 when she returned to Japan. She essentially stayed there as a training ship and transport until mid-October 1944. From then until mid-March of 1945, she ran supplies and escorted convoys to Taiwan and Shanghai to try to prepare them for any potential American invasion. With the East China Sea essentially closed to what little remained of the Japanese shipping after March of 1945, she spent the rest of the war escorting convoys to and from Korea. Post-war, she was used in reparations duties and was finally scrapped in 1947. Kashi spent the first 7 months of the war taking part in the capture and occupation of the East Indies. In July and August of 1942, she took part in the invasion of Burma, then returned to the East Indies, where she essentially remained until the end of 1943, when she returned to Japan. Following conversion at the start of May 1944, she began escorting convoys from Japan to the East Indies and back. On January 12, 1945, while returning to Japan, her convoy was attacked by American carrier planes in the South China Sea. During the attack, at about 2:15 p.m., 2 bombs set off her depth charges at her rear. Burning ferociously, she sank stern first.